Hello everyone, my name is Austin Taylor and this is my CSC 325 tutorial mission 2 video. In this video I will be demonstrating everything that I've completed for this tutorial, so let's get started. The first thing that the tutorial has you do is to update your Unity that you have installed on your computer. They have you update it to the 2020.1 version. From there they have you use the hub to download the project for this. So you go to learn, and then there is the project. You can see I already have it downloaded. I had an issue though when I downloaded it. It would open in a 3D project, not a 2D project. Fortunately, they had alternative instructions for what to do if you ran into issues. What they had you do instead was create a 2D Unity project and then go to the asset store and find the Ruby tutorial and then download that and then import the assets from there. After that, the tutorial proceeded to talk about the different windows and layouts that are in the Unity editor. So they talked about the hierarchy, the inspector window, the project window. They had you dock the console over here, and then this is the scene view, and they talked about the game view. Then they show you how you can move around in the scene using these tools up here and how you can use those to move different game objects and things like that. In the next part of the tutorial, they have you download the Ruby sprite character, and then they have you import the character. So if I go over to my sprite here, so here's the Ruby image that they had me download, and then they have you turn it into the sprite by clicking that arrow there and then either dragging it to the hierarchy or onto the scene view. The tutorial then has you create a script for Ruby so that you can create some player controls, and then you'll update the script as you progress throughout the tutorial. In the first part of it, they show you how you can move the position of Ruby by using the transform property. The next thing that the tutorial shows you is where you can go in the Unity editor to find the input accesses. So if I go this shows the different input axes, and then you can see its name is horizontal, and then that the buttons are, well, the keys are left and right, and A and D. They then have you modify your Ruby script. So here is my Ruby script. It has a whole bunch of stuff, but at this part, they were working on this part here, which I have commented out. What they have you do for that part of it is they have you modify the code so that when the user presses either the left or the right key or the A or D key, it's going to move the Ruby sprite along the x-axis, and then if the user pressed the up or down keys or the W or S keys, it'll move it up and down along the y-axis. Another thing that they showed was how you can change how many frames per second your object will be rendered in. In the tutorial, they have you set your Ruby character to move 1 unit every 10 frames. This code up here is part of that. You can see it's set to the 10 frame right there that I have commented out. When it's set to the 10 frames per second, it moves very slowly. But they show you in the tutorial how you can change it. So your Ruby character moves in units per second instead of units per frame. In the next part of the tutorial, they show you how you can make tile maps to decorate your game world. They show you how you can create a tile map game object and then assign a sprite to that tile map. So when you create your tile map game object, it creates this game object with it. So here is my tile map. They have you download a tile image, and then they have you create a folder called tiles, which is this one right here. And then they have you create your first tile, which is this one right here. And they have you set the tile image you downloaded and set it to its sprite property up here in the inspector window. The tutorial then has you open up the tile palette and create a new tile palette and add your tile to that tile palette. So if you go up to Windows and you go down to 2D, and you can click tile palette, and then it'll open up the tile palette, and you just drag and drop your first tile into the tile palette. The tutorial then shows you how you can use the brush to paint your game world with the selected tile, and how to adjust the pixels per unit so that your tile will look right in the scene view. So when I originally had this tile here selected and I was using the brush tool up here to paint my game world, there was like this weird little gap that would show up. But if you went to where you had your tile image, you changed, because originally this was 100, which wasn't the correct size, because down here this is only a 64 by 64 pixels. So if you set it to that, it'll fill the way it's supposed to look. They then show you how you can take a sprite and divide it up into multiple slices so that you can use different parts of the sprite. And then you can add those pieces to your tile palette. So if I go to my environment, they had this piece here as one whole piece, but as you can see, I have it split up into multiple pieces. So if I click this, what they had you do is they had you go over to the sprite mode and they set it to multiple. I'm just gonna exit out this for a second. And then you have to hit apply once you change it to multiple, and then you go to the sprite editor, which will pull up this, and you go to slice, and they have you do it by grid by count, and then you set how many rows and columns that you want. In our case, we wanted 3 columns, 3 rows, and then you would hit slice, and then you would hit apply, and then it would slice up this image into each individual little pieces that you can use to then paint your game world. And then you can just drag that whole thing into your tile palette, which I placed right there. The next thing that they have you do is they have you set your tile map game object so that its order in the layer is to -10. That way, when Unity renders everything, the characters and other game objects are drawn on top of your background tile map and not having the tile map drawn in front of them. And you can see that the order and layer here is set to -10. In the next part of the tutorial, they have you change your graphic settings so that Unity draws the sprites based on their y-axis. Prior to doing that, it would look like this. As you can see, the Ruby character is sometimes drawn on top of, sometimes it's drawn behind, and it doesn't look right, so they have you fix that. So what they do is they have you go to your graphics settings, and then they have you change it to a custom axis, and then they have you change the way it's drawn so that it's based on the y-axis. They then have you change the sprite sort paint of Ruby from center to pivot so that Ruby is in front of something or behind something based on the pivot point. And you can change that setting right here. They then have you change the pivot point of the metal cube so that it's at the bottom instead of the center. That way, when Ruby is drawn, she'll look like she's behind the box when she's above it, and she'll look like she's in front of the box when she's below it. They also have you change the location of Ruby's pivot point by using the sprite editor and edit the pivot point so that it's lower, 0 in this case. So if I go to Ruby and I go, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong spot. If I go to Ruby and I go to her sprite editor, if I can get that out of the way, there is her pivot point and it's at the bottom of her foot. Then they show you how to make prefabs, which keeps the settings and changes you made from the game object. So if you have something in the hierarchy, if you select it and you drag and drop it down in this folder and then go and click on it, and any changes you make here when you open up the prefab will be saved and it'll be updated to all the other prefabs in your hierarchy. However, if you change something on one of the objects in your hierarchy. Like if I change this one, I change its color to like that, then it's the only thing that's affected. The other ones are not, unless I went over to overrides, and you can see it says the sprite render, something changed there. And then you can either apply to all or you can revert to all. I'm going to do revert. Next part of the tutorial, they show you how to add a rigid body to your character to give your character some physics properties. If I click Ruby, you can see she has the rigid body. What you do is you go down to add component, and then you type in the component you're looking for. And then there's two of them. This one is for a 3D game. This one's for a 2D game, which that's the one I added. And then the next thing they have you do in the rigid body 2D, they have you get rid of the gravity. That way your character doesn't fall off of your scene. They also have you freeze the rotation. I'll explain why in a little bit. Also have you add colliders to Ruby and to the metal boxes. The colliders tell the rigid body on the Ruby what parts of the game are solid. This way, Ruby won't pass through the metal boxes. The reason that they have you freeze the rotation is so when Ruby's collides with the metal boxes, it won't rotate her. So like if she hits it, she's not going to turn sideways. The tutorial then has you fix the jittering effect that happens. So previously when Ruby would hit these boxes, her movement would look kind of jittery, and that's because of the physics component that's with the rigid body. It's like doing some calculations, and it keeps updating those because we have the movement we had the movement set in the update function to fix that. What they had us do in the Ruby script was create a fixed update function, and then we put the moving controls in that. And we created a rigid body 2 variable to get the current position of Ruby based off of her rigid body 2. And then we updated her position using that instead of using the transform property as we did earlier. The next thing that they have you do is adjust the size of the box colliders for Ruby and the metal boxes. That way they're not so big and it will look more realistic and have like better gameplay. So if I go back here and I select Ruby, and I'm just going to open up the prefab. Where is your prefab? Oh, down here. So you can see this little green part right there. This is her box collider, and it's down by her feet. Originally, it encompassed her whole body. And so like when a little bit of her was close to the box, it would be running into it, and it just didn't look realistic. The next thing the tutorial has you do is add a collider to the tile map. So I know it's kind of hard to see, but there's a green line that goes around the water. And in order to do that, what they have you do is they have you go to your tiles, and they have you select all the pieces that you don't want to have the collider box, and you select those, and you set their collider type to none. After that, on the tile map game object, they have you add a composite collider. That way it will make a bigger collider box instead of a bunch of individual box colliders on those areas that Ruby shouldn't be able to run across. Doing so lessens the burden of the physics system when the game is running, so your game will run better. In the next part of the tutorial, they have you create health for Ruby, and you make a change health function. So let me go here. Up at the top here, we have the max health, and then we have the current health. And then at the start of it, we set the current health to the max health, and then they have you create the change health function, which is right here. The purpose of the change health function is to either add or take away health to your Ruby character, depending on whether she picks up like a health item or she's taken damage. Which leads to my next part, where they have you make a health collectible game object. In here, that is this little strawberry thing. So they have you do the same thing for like you did for the metal boxes. They have you add the sprite, give it a box collider, resize the image, change the box collider size. And then the other thing that I have you do, which is different from the metal cubes, is they have you add it as a trigger. So there we go. So this way, when Ruby runs into it, she's not stopped by it. The trigger is used so that when Ruby runs into it, it sets off this little trigger so we know that she's run into it, but she's not blocked by it because the trigger part is checked. They then have you create a health collectible script. The first part that they have you do is add a debug log. That way you can see what is causing the trigger. In this case, it would be the Ruby character. After we see that the debug log is working, that we can see that Ruby is triggering when she runs into the health collectible. They have us change the code so that Ruby's health is increased by 1, and then the game object is destroyed. They then have you modify the Ruby script to see if Ruby actually needs any health. Because if Ruby is at full health, she shouldn't be able to pick up the health collectible. The next thing the tutorial has you do is create a damageable zone, which is right here. The process is very similar to creating the health collectible, except instead of giving health, you take the health away. And then here is the code for that. So we're getting the current health. If it's not null, then we change the health by -1. One thing that's different here is this says on trigger stay. If you look at the health collectible one, it says on trigger enter. The reason we have it here is as stay, we want it so when Ruby's standing on the damageable zone, she should be continually taking damage. The next thing they have you change is they have you set Ruby's Rigibody. Let me grab Ruby real quick. They have you change Ruby's Rigibody's sleeping mode to never sleep. That way, when she's standing in here, she's just standing there, she'll continually to lose health, even if she's not moving. Whereas before, it's like she had to like go in and she'd get hurt, and then get out, and then go back in and she'd get hurt. Doing this, however, caused Ruby to lose all her health within like 5 frames of just standing there, which is not what we'd want. So they have us change the Ruby controller script so that she is invincible for a limited amount of time. So I go up to the top here, we have the time invincible, and then we have is invincible to check if she is, and then we have the timer. And then down here in the lower part, here is where we are checking to see if Ruby is invincible, and then decreasing the time. That way, if she is, the timer goes and she's not invincible forever, and then it gets set back to false. The tutorial also shows you how if you stretch the damage zone, it looks distorted. So let me show that. So this is what it would look like if you had stretched it. And then they show how you can fix it by changing its draw mode to tiled so that multiple damage zone sprites are created when you make the sprite bigger. So if I go here, I go to my damageable, I look at my draw mode, I have it as tiled before, I believe it was on simple. Another thing that they have you do is you have to check the box for the auto tiling in your damage zones box collider here. Otherwise, it's just going to have one box collider and it's not going to fill for the rest of them. So by having that checked, it puts one for each of my damage zones that I have on my scene. They then have you create an enemy sprite, which is my robot guy, which is right here, right there. And they have you add on a box collider to them and a ridge body. Then they have you work on the enemy controller script. And then they have you set up the script so he moves back and forth, which is this part here for if he's going along the y-axis, and this part here if he's moving along the x-axis. Then they have you add in some code so that if your Ruby character runs into the robot, Ruby takes damage, which is this part here. We're getting the player, and then we're changing its health by -1. In the next part of the tutorial, they have you add animation to your robot. First, they have you add the animator component to your robot prefab. So I go to my prefabs here, look at my robot. There's the animator component. They then have you create an animator controller, which is right here. So they have you create this controller. And then in the animator component, they have you set the controller to the one that you created. After that, they have you go into the animator window, and then they show you how you can animate your character using sprite sheets. So I go to Windows, and I go to Animation. I go to the animation window. It shows this here. And then if I go over to my characters and their sprite sheet, they have you drag the correct sprites and then put them in here to create your sprite sheet animation. So if I go into my robot prefab, I don't know why that's so zoomed out. To open up the window again. See, I have my robot sprite, and then it shows him right there. When you play it, move this down. It shows him moving. Originally, it was set to something like 24 frames, which makes him move like really, really fast. So they have you slow it down in the samples. After you make all of the animations for the different ways the robot can move, they have you go into the animator, and from there they have you set it up so that when the robot is moving a certain direction, the proper animation is played. So if I go back to my window and I go to animation, I go to animator, it opens up the window, and then they have you create a blend tree. And inside the blend tree, they have you create these two nodes. After adding these two parameters to your blend tree, they have you add these 4 motion fields, and then you assign an animation to the motion fields, and then you can adjust when it is supposed to play based off of its position. So here, when the X is -0.5, it's going to start playing the left animation. When it's 0.5, it's going to do the right animation. When the Y is positive 0.5, it plays the up animation, and when it's negative 0.5 on the Y, it'll play the down animation. Then they have you modify the enemy controller script and set the parameters for the blend tree with the correct information. So if it's vertical, it's going to set the move Y based on the direction that it's moving. If it's positive, it's going to start playing the upward animation. If it's negative, it's going to play the downward animation. And same if it's for the x-axis, if it's moving to the left or negative, it's going to play the left animation. If it's positive for the x-axis, it's going to play the right animation. In a similar fashion, they have you do it for the Ruby character, although they don't have you actually make the animation for the Ruby character. They just have you add in the animator component and then add the animation controller to Ruby. They already made the animations for Ruby's sprite set. They do have you look at it though. So this is Ruby's. You can see she's got different things than what we did for the robot. Some of the things that you can see here is that there's these arrows, which are transitions. So it will transition because Ruby has different animations that play for when she's not moving and when she is. And then they have this little transition part that takes place, which is what these arrows are, which is why there shouldn't be like any transition between when she gets hit and when she's launching. Because she shouldn't be able to launch a projectile when she's hit. And then similar to the enemy script for getting the correct animation to set the correct movement for the animation to play, they have you do the same thing for the Ruby script. So they have you set when you're looking the correct direction and then the speed. The next part of the tutorial, they have you give Ruby the ability to throw a projectile. They have you create the projectile sprite just like you did with the other sprites, and then they give it a box collider and a rigid body to it. And then they have you create the script for the projectile. So if I go back here, here is my projectile script. This code shows how we get the rigid body of the projectile. And then when the projectile is launched, this right here shows how we move it based off the direction and then the force that is applied to it. Then in the Ruby controller, they have you create a launch function that instantiates a projectile game object to move the projectile in the direction that Ruby is facing and play the correct launch animation, which mine is down here. So this is the code for that. Here we're instantiating the game object, and then we're setting it to the direction, and then that's the force that gets applied. I know that Dr. Spradlin had posted a thing on Discord showing that how we should pool objects because it's better for the CPU's resources and it's not so heavy to run the game by creating and destroying objects over and over. I haven't had a chance to look at that though. So I did not implement that part here, but I do plan on checking it out when I get some time. After that, they show you how to fix a layering issue that's caused by the projectile and the Ruby. They were originally on the same layer, which meant that the projectile would collide with the Ruby object. So they have you create different layers for them to be on. So you can see the projectile has its own projectile layer, and then similarly, Ruby is on her own character layer. And you can add more layers by going to here. By default, the first 7 layers are not accessible. It's something that Unity has set up, so you can't mess with those layers. And then they have you go into the project settings. And they have you go to the physics 2D. If you scroll down, you can see the layer collision matrix. And here they have you uncheck the projectile where it collides with the character. The next thing they have you do is modify the enemy script so that when the robot gets hit with the projectile, he gets fixed in this case. So if I go to my enemy controller, there is a fix function. So right now he is set to broken. When this is called, broken is set to false, and then the fixed animation will play. If I go to my projectile script and I go to the on collision enter 2D function, we get the enemy controller collider. And then if it's not null, we call the fix function, and then we destroy the projectile game object. They also have you add in as part of the script this right here, which says that if the projectile moves a certain amount of units, it destroys the game object. They do this so that the game object doesn't just, well, the projectile doesn't just keep flying throughout the screen forever and ever. They also gave you the option to add in the fixed animation for your enemy controller, which is what I did. So when my enemy gets hit by the projectile, it plays the fixed animation. So when my enemy gets hit, he dances. The next thing the tutorial has you do is make it so that the camera follows your character around, but they make it so it also doesn't exceed a certain point on the screen. To do this, they have you download the sign machine and they have you import that. They then have you create a sign machine virtual camera that the main camera will copy its settings from. They have you go into the virtual camera and then they change the orthographic size to 5. That way it's zoomed in to what it was originally. When you first create it, it's set to 10, which is zoomed out more than you would like it to be. So they have you change that to 5 so it's back to where it should be. After that, they have you set the camera so it follows Ruby, which I do right here. And then they have you add the extension for the Cinemachine confiner. After that, they have you create an empty game object and give it a polygon box collider. So if I look at my camera confiner, this is the one that has that. So there's a faint little line going around the edges there, which has my polygon collider. Makes it so that the camera won't exceed beyond the bounds of the polygon collider. They then have you go into the layer collision matrix again. So if I go to project settings, and they have you uncheck everything in the confiner row column. And then for the camera, they have you set the camera confiner object to the bounding to shape 2D. In the next part of the tutorial, they have you add a smoke effect to your robot using the particle system. If I go to my smoke effect, you can see this plane right here. The particle system has quite a bit of options that you can use, and they have us select 2 of the smoke sprites, and then they show us how we can randomly set those to the different sprites and how it cycles through them. And they also show us how you can change the size over the lifetime of them, and then they fade at the end of it. They then have you in the robot prefab set it so that the smoke effect is a child of the robot and then it's placed near the top of his head. They also have you change the simulation space to world so that it kind of follows the robot more, looks a little bit more realistic. They also have you create a public variable of the particle system type, and then they have you add the smoke effect to that. And then in the enemy controller script, when he is fixed or he stopped the smoke effect, and instead of destroying that game object, stopping it will just cause the particle system not to create any new particles. If we destroyed it, they would just kind of poof and disappear all at once, which wouldn't look very nice. Stopping it just causes them to kind of fizzle out slowly. In the next part of the tutorial, they have you create a user interface for Ruby's health and scripts that change the amount of health shown based on how much health Ruby has. They have you set a canvas, which is right here. Let me zoom out. They have you set the canvas to a constant pixel size so that it doesn't change no matter what size screen it's being displayed on. It will change it accordingly. Then they go through of how to add an image to the canvas and add anchors so that the images stay where they are supposed to. Then next they show you how you can add a mask, which will hide portions of the health bar when Ruby gets hurt. They then show you how to create the script for the health bar that will show how much health Ruby has, and then modify the script to set it to the correct amount of health that should be displayed based on how much health Ruby has. So here is the health bar UI scripts that will change how much of the mask is shown. based on how much health Ruby has. And then here in my change health function, this passes the parameters for what health should be shown. In the next part of the tutorial, they have you create an NPC for Ruby to interact with. They have you create a frog sprite, and they have you give him a box collider, and then there's also a dialogue box that will appear when Ruby goes to talk with them, and they show you how to make those scripts. So the scripts that they provide us with show us how to use raycasting so that when the Ruby character is facing the frog, she can interact with him that way. And if she's facing away from him, you won't be able to interact with him. So this is the raycasting script here. And then if the character is facing the NPC and the character and the user presses X, then it will display the dialog box above the NPC. And then this is the script that displays the dialog box for the NPC. The next part of the tutorial, they have you create sound and background music. So if I go back here, they have you create an empty game object, and then they have you add the audio source component to it, and then they have you assign the background music to the audio clip slot. And then they have you check loop. Then they have you add an audio source to the Ruby character and have you create a play sound function that takes in an audio clip and plays that clip when the function is called, which I can show right here if I go to my Ruby controller. If I go down, so there is my play sound function that takes in an audio clip as a parameter, and then it's going to play that. And it's just only going to play it for one little clip. They then have you modify the health collectible script so that when Ruby collects the health, it's going to pass the correct audio clip to its play sound function. And then it's going to play that sound once. The tutorial then gives you the option to add the other clips that they provide you with, and I chose to add the audio clips for the footsteps, the projectiles when it's thrown, and then when the Ruby character takes damage. They then show you how you can add spatialization to your audio for the robot, so that as the robot is closer to one side of Ruby, it gets louder on that side. So if the Ruby is closer to the left side of Ruby, or more on the left side, I should say, then on your left speaker, it will be louder. In order to get the attenuation to work properly, you have to create a child object of the main camera. And then you have to add on an audio listener component to that child, and then you have to set its Z position to 10, so that the audio listener is in front of the main camera, and then the attenuation will behave properly, and then the sound will move from the left to the right speaker as Ruby is closer or farther away from the robot. The final part of the tutorial has you do is look at the different player settings that are available for you to configure. So if I go to the project settings and I click player, it shows you the different options here that you can configure. You can add a splash screen or an icon. Then they have you create a build. If you go to File, Build Settings, and then they have you select which scenes you want, and then that has you create your build for the current platform that you created the Unity project on. In my case, it was a Windows computer. And then after that build is done, you can run the executable file and you can play your game. You do have to use Alt F4 to get out of the game though, as it doesn't have like a way to exit the game. So I will just show the Ruby game executable, and I'll just play it so you can see that it runs. can hit the robots, I can walk around, I can talk to that guy, and then the dialogue will disappear after a second or two. The camera follows the character, I can take damage, and I can get health. And that is it for my tutorial mission 2. I had a really fun time with this tutorial and I learned a lot from it. I want to thank everyone for watching and have a great day.